Before we talk about the moment, Officer Daniels realized his entire career was over. Let's talk about how it all began. It was just another day on the job, another shift, another report to file. Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car, scanning the streets like he always did. And then, he saw him. A young black teen, walking alone, hands in his pockets. To Daniels, that was enough. He didn't need to know the teen's name. He didn't care where he was going or why he was there. In his mind, the boy looked suspicious. And in Daniels's world, that was a crime. Within minutes, he had the teen face down on the pavement, cuffs tight around his wrists. He smirked, thinking it was just another routine arrest. But just hours later, Daniel's smirk would disappear. Because when his boss walked in with the truth, everything he thought he knew was about to collapse. Before we talk about the moment Officer Daniels' entire world came crashing down, let's meet the three people at the center of this story. First, there's Officer Daniels. A veteran cop, respected by some, feared by others. He wasn't the kind of officer who protected and served. He was the kind who controlled and intimidated. To him, power meant superiority. He believed certain people were naturally suspicious, and more often than not, those people happened to be black. His record was filled with unjustified stops, unnecessary arrests, and excessive force complaints, all ignored or covered up. Then there's the teen. A young black boy, no older than 17. Smart, respectful, and raised to know his rights. Unlike Daniels, he believed in fairness. He came from a powerful family, but he never used that power to look down on others. He had seen injustice before, but he had never been at the center of it. Until today. And finally, there's Police Chief Reynolds, a man of integrity. He had spent years trying to clean up the force, but Daniels was a stain that just wouldn't come out. The chief had been watching him for a while, waiting for the moment he could hold him accountable. Today was that moment. These three men were about to collide, and by the end of the day, only one of them would still have a future in law enforcement. Before we talk about the moment Officer Daniels realized he had made a terrible mistake, let's talk about the arrest that started it all. The sun was setting as the teen walked home. He had just finished basketball practice, his gym bag slung over his shoulder. His school was just a few blocks away, his home just a few more. He had walked this route 100 times before, but today was different. Sitting in his patrol car, Officer Daniels watched him closely. His hand hovered over the radio. He wasn't responding to a call. There was no crime in progress. He was simply waiting for a reason to act. And in his mind, the reason was clear. A young black boy, alone, hands in his pockets. Daniels flicked on his lights and pulled up fast, blocking the teen's path. "Hey you! Stop right there!" Daniels barked. The teen slowed down, confused. "Is something wrong, officer?" His tone was calm, his posture relaxed. He knew better than to act defensive. Daniels stepped out of the car, hand on his holster. "What are you doing around here?" "I'm walking home." "Uh-huh," Daniels scoffed. "Got some ID on you?" The teen hesitated, not because he had anything to hide, but because he had seen this happen before. Not to him, but to others. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. Daniel's jaw clenched. He didn't like being questioned. "You look suspicious. Hands in your pockets, lurking around. Where exactly do you live?" The teen's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. "A few blocks away," he answered. "I go to Lincoln High. My house is on Elm Street." Daniels chuckled mockingly. "Elm Street? That's a pretty expensive neighborhood. And you expect me to believe you live there?" The teen sighed. He knew where this was going. No matter what he said, Daniels had already made up his mind. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer," he said. Daniels stepped closer, his voice sharp. "You got drugs on you?" The teen frowned. "No." Daniels didn't believe him, didn't want to believe him. Without warning, he grabbed the teen's arm and spun him around. The boy barely had time to react before he was being shoved against the hood of the car. "Hey!" the teen started, but Daniels yanked his hands behind his back. "Stop resisting," Daniels sneered. "I'm not resisting." A few bystanders stopped and stared, pulling out their phones. Some shouted in protest, telling Daniels to let the teen go. But Daniels just tightened the cuffs and smirked. To him, this was just another day on the job. What he didn't know was that this time, he had just arrested the wrong person. Before we talk about the moment Officer Daniels realized his career was over, let's talk about the hours leading up to it. The teen sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists still sore from the cuffs. Daniels had driven back to the station with no urgency, no concern, just another arrest in his mind. The station was busy, officers coming and going, the smell of stale coffee and ink from fresh reports filling the air. Daniels marched the teen inside. No questions, no second thought, just routine. "Print him," Daniels said to the desk officer, tossing his paperwork onto the counter. "We got another one who thought he was too good to follow orders." The desk officer hesitated, glancing at the teen. Something about him seemed different. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't shouting about injustice. He was calm, almost too calm. Daniels didn't notice. He was too busy bragging. "That kid had an attitude," Daniels laughed, shaking his head. "Like he really thought he could talk back to me." Another officer chuckled. "Another one for the books, huh?" Daniels smirked. "Yeah, another punk off the streets." Meanwhile, the teen sat quietly in the holding cell. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply watched. He had seen people like Daniels before, and he knew exactly what was coming. Hours passed. Then, suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The sound of heavy footsteps filled the station. Officers turned their heads toward the entrance as Chief Reynolds stormed in. His face was tight with anger, his jaw clenched. Everyone fell silent. Daniels leaned back in his chair, still unbothered, until he saw the look in the chief's eyes. The chief stopped in front of Daniels' desk, slamming a thick file down with a loud thud. "Do you have any idea who you just arrested?" the chief asked, his voice dangerously low. Daniels frowned. He sat up slightly. "Just another punk who needed to be taught a lesson," he muttered. The chief's hands tightened into fists. His next words made the entire room freeze. Before we talk about the moment Daniels realized his biggest mistake, let's talk about what was inside that file. The chief pushed the folder toward him. "Open it." Daniels hesitated, then flipped the cover open. His blood ran cold. Right there in front of him was a photo of the teen, and next to it, his full name. Daniel's throat went dry. The last name was familiar. Too familiar. The chief leaned in, his voice sharp. "That punk you arrested? That's the mayor's son." Silence. Complete, deafening silence. Daniels' chest tightened. His mind raced. "The same mayor," the chief continued, his voice dripping with rage, "who fought to fund this department. The same mayor who personally hired me to clean up this station." Daniels swallowed hard. The chief's eyes burned into him. "And you arrested his son without cause." Daniels stuttered. I didn't know." "That's the problem," the chief snapped. "You didn't know, and yet you threw him into a holding cell like a criminal." The other officers stayed silent. Some glanced at each other, knowing this was bad. The chief turned toward the cell. "Let him out, now." Within seconds, the lock clicked open and the teen stepped out. He looked at the chief, nodded, then turned to Daniels. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was disappointed. "If I were just a regular kid," the teen said quietly, "would you have cared?" Daniels had no answer. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, and the consequences were just beginning. Before we talk about the moment Daniels lost everything, let's talk about how the truth unraveled. The chief wasn't done, not even close. He turned to the officers gathered around. "This department has let people like Daniels get away with this for too long," he said, his voice firm. "But not anymore." And with that, The real investigation began. As complaints were pulled, patterns emerged. Daniels's record was full of unjustified stops, excessive force reports, and racial profiling complaints. The mayor was furious. "This isn't just about my son," he said at a press conference. "This is about every black citizen who has been unfairly targeted by officers like him." The public backlash was immediate. The bystander footage from the arrest went viral. It spread across social media like wildfire, people demanding action. Within days, Daniels was suspended. Within weeks, he was fired from the force. His badge was stripped away, and he was escorted out of the station like a criminal. Daniels watched the world turn against him. News reports labeled him as a disgrace. Protests outside the department called for reform. And yet, the teen never spoke badly about him. Instead, when asked about it in an interview, he said, "It's not about one bad cop. It's about fixing the system that allows them to exist." Daniels watched the interview from his couch, the world moving on without him. And for the first time in his life, he realized what he had thrown away. He had spent his career abusing power, and now he had none left. Before we talk about the moment Officer Daniels understood what true power really is, let's talk about the aftermath of his downfall. Daniels had once walked through the world untouchable. He wore his badge like armor, believing it protected him from consequences. But now, that badge was gone. The firing wasn't just a loss of a job, it was a loss of identity. He tried to apply to other departments, but no one would take him. His name had been plastered all over the news, tied to racism, misconduct, and excessive force. No police force wanted that kind of baggage. He tried security jobs. They wouldn't take him either. Even local businesses didn't want to be associated with the officer who arrested the mayor's son unjustly. It wasn't just about the mayor's son anymore. It was about every person he had mistreated. The world had changed. The system that once protected him had finally turned against him. Meanwhile, the teen he had once treated like a criminal was becoming a leader. News outlets started covering his story, not just because of his wrongful arrest, but because of what he did afterward. He didn't just move on, he took action. With his father, the mayor, he pushed for reforms in policing. New policies were introduced: training on racial bias, accountability measures for officers, body cameras required at all times. It wasn't about revenge, it was about change. And then, one day, Daniel saw something that made his stomach tighten. A news broadcast. The teen was standing at a podium speaking to a massive crowd about fairness in law enforcement, about how policing should be about protecting, not controlling. Daniel stared at the screen, watching the crowd cheer for him. This kid, the one he had looked down on, the one he had treated like he was nothing, was now changing the world. And in that moment, Daniels realized something that hit harder than any punishment. Respect isn't taken, it's earned. Power isn't about control, it's about responsibility. He had spent his career misusing power. Now, he was powerless, watching a boy he once thought was beneath him stand above him in every way that mattered. Before we end this story, let's talk about the real lesson here. Daniels had once believed he was untouchable, that his uniform, his badge, his authority meant he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. But life has a way of humbling people. He thought he had control, but in reality, he had nothing. The teen, on the other hand, had everything Daniels lacked: integrity, resilience, leadership. He never used his power to intimidate. Instead, he used it to uplift and inspire. And that's the moral of the story. Never judge someone by the color of their skin. Power doesn't make you untouchable, character does. The people you look down on today might be the ones who stand above you tomorrow. Daniels learned the truth too late, but you don't have to. Because in the end, true power isn't in a badge, a uniform, or a title. It's in how you choose to treat others. Because the world remembers who stood for justice and who fell because they didn't.